Welcome to Portals of Perception and to part 3 of our exploration with Brendan Graham Dempsey. Brendan, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be back.
Well, we just landed part 2 that took a curious turn, and we laid a whole set of scaffolds in the beginning through the 6 stories of Jesus, the 6 layers, and then integrated into it a contextual appreciation for what esoteric is in the sense of exoteric, mesoteric, and esoteric. I'll bring up the slide in a moment. And then we took a different direction that never enabled us to fulfill our promise at the beginning of the conversation to actually explore and journey into the significance of the Transfiguration and the significance of the resurrection. And I experienced the energy potential in needing to slow down. And actually, I feel that what you articulated in terms of how do we make this journey, and we went back and forth in carving a way to enable a space that perhaps is not defined by the gravitational logic that we process every day, and at the same time that is not going to abandon certain frameworks and certain ways of thinking and being that will afford us freedom and safety and collaboration and ultimately possibilities to solve big problems on the global stage. So what would you say, by way of bridging from that to our desire here to travel, to skate into the esoteric?
Yeah. So, I'm really glad we were able to get into that stuff, because those are the tensions and questions that are most alive for me. They don't need to be, answered right now, but I feel like this will be, now that those are surfaced, they can be part of sort of the background context for our exploration of these things. An idea that comes to my mind is we could then just move into an exploration of the esoteric aspects of the Transfiguration and the resurrection as you want to present them, and then I could kind of play off of that and kind of maybe inevitably wind up bringing in some of those aspects from what got raised earlier to see if if they land, or if not, why, and relate it back to that. So that'd be one approach, is we can kind of move into this and then kind of in real time process, the esoteric aspect and what a engagement or a dialogue between the esoteric aspect and a critical aspect looks like. Or we can jump more into that conversation again and try to hammer out some more of those aspects at a conceptual level before we dive into that material. So that's up to you. Those are just 2 ideas that come to mind.
Okay, so here is what I'd like to propose. Let me bring the slide and to use it as a guide in the conversation. So these are the 6 stories, and what I would like to invite that we skate and ask your help in, first of all, appreciating those dimensions, perhaps with that dimension too. What is the Transfiguration? If somebody is not a Christian scholar or was not born and raised in the Christian faith, what is the significance of the Transfiguration, typically described to have happened at Mount Tabor, which is a very, very special place for me, which I can mention in a few minutes. And the way I imagine that is to get help from you in those 5 layers, and for me then to, again, offer an esoteric contemplation with the guidances. You don't have to agree with that, but can you take the lens without immediately judging it through the rational or the logic mind that you typically apply, but more in terms of, well, what does it feel like to embrace these lens? That's how I'm proposing we will skate into this experiment.
Yeah, that sounds good. So do you want me to, I can set up the Transfiguration a little bit first, and then do you want me to pause there, or should I just launch into these kinds of story readings of that?
Please, yeah.
Okay.
Can you set it up? What is the occasion? Who is Jesus climbing the mountain with? Three of his disciples, and what's occurring there? And then, if you were to try to actually narrate this through those different layers, that would be very powerful.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so I will say it would be, I probably should have read it through before our conversation, but I think that my memory of the story should suffice for this. But it basically, it's in, a quick Google revealed it's Matthew 17. And I'm not sure if it's in other Gospels, or I wouldn't be surprised if it's only in Matthew, but we could come back to that. But it's a story, at least in Matthew, about Jesus going up on a hilltop with three of his closest disciples, and there his appearance changes, and you'd say it's transfigured. It's a changing of his figuration. He looks different. He winds up glowing with this radiant light, and his three disciples, which I believe are John, Peter, and James, thank you. So his three closest disciples, they're kind of blinded by this and just kind of in awe. And they look at and they see Jesus, who's been totally transfigured from kind of his normal state into this glowing, radiant, bright state. And not only do they see him, they also see Moses and Elijah, who he's with on this mountain. And then so they're taken aback by this and really amazed. And then Peter, I think it is, says to Jesus something like, "Oh, hey, here's Moses and Elijah. Should we make some tents for them too? Like we're gonna hang out here." And then Jesus says something in kind of typical form to reply to Peter, like he doesn't get it. And I don't remember exactly what that is. But then basically the kind of light and everything sort of fades and he goes back to his normal state. And I believe the story even ends with Jesus saying, "Don't tell anyone that this happened," or like, don't tell anyone about this. And so that is sort of basically the story in the Bible that we read. And if I left out any key plot points, feel free to add those in.
I think the voice that comes through declares, "This is my son whom I love.
Right.
With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." So that's because Peter at that point is negotiating that there are three here and they need to address all three, and there is a corrective guiding voice.
Yeah. So that being said, how do we then read this story through these different levels? Well, I will say everything we've just said is happening at the literal level here, right? So these are stories that we're finding in the Gospels, or at least a Gospel. And so we read them as such. They were crafted to tell an event in narrative form, but we are getting them mediated in that sense. So when we try to go that level higher to the historic there, that becomes a very interesting interpretive question for people. And there's different ways of trying to think about what that means. The most immediate, we would just ask, okay, if we have this story, well, did this quote unquote happen, right? It's one thing to tell a story. We can talk about, the Easter Bunny and whatnot in story form, but that doesn't mean the Easter Bunny exists in historic time. So then the question at that first level would be, if this happened, what did that look like, right? And what is sort of maybe the potential difference between imagining yourself standing there in historical time, seeing this happen, or seeing them see this happen, versus what we kind of read on the page. But I will say, I mean, this is an interesting thing because the difference between the historic and the literal is itself a really important distinction that we shouldn't just elide. This is a story and it's trying to communicate something. And there's a lot going on to the way that the gospel writers tell stories and what they're trying to convey in their telling of stories, right? So you'd reminded me that there's a voice comes from the heaven. It's God's voice. He says, "This is my son." Well, that's a direct callback to what happens at the beginning of the gospel when Jesus gets baptized and basically gets, his divine sanction, or at least it begins his ministry. It's the same words repeated. So there's this thematic element of God is, being very explicit that this is the nature of this being, of this person, Jesus. He is his son. And as you point out, there's a theological move going on there because you've got Elijah and you've got Moses, both figures important from the Jewish context. But here, sort of Jesus is being singled out as being, the big kahuna. And so that's important also because, Matthew's gospel is it is the most engaging with the Jewish milieu in which Christianity arose. So if you read the Gospel of Luke, that's more aimed at pagans. If you read the Gospel of Matthew, that's much more a situation of Jesus in his sort of Jewish context. And so the fact that we find this story in that gospel, Jesus going to the top of the mountain, there's a lot of significance there. But that, I would say, is kind of maybe largely at the cultural and the parable level, which I'll get into in a second. But at the very least, we've got maybe not a historic event. We certainly have a story about something that occurred, and that's what we're reading. So then once you kind of deal with that kind of surface level structure there, and then you try to get into the deeper aspects, and here we're moving into the cultural ethos, into the parable aspect. What do we have there? Well, I guess the cultural ethos aspect, we've got a couple of layers we could consider. One is, what does this story mean in its cultural ethos of, say, first century, Christian Jewish relations and sort of religion in Palestine at this moment, all that kind of stuff. But I think more broadly in the Christian context, we could think about, what does this story mean in the whole Christian tradition? And I will say it's a beautiful, some of the greatest works of art have been depicting this scene. I want to say Raphael does a wonderful version of this. But you can see this story depicted in beautiful paintings. It's often on stained glass windows in cathedrals and whatnot. And so this is part of sort of the cultural taking up of Christianity that occurs, and it's a big part of that. And it is a big part because it's such a emphasis on Jesus's identity and his transcendent nature. And that sort of gets us to the parable element, which is sort of like, what's going on here in a sense. You could say, like, what's the message that one carries forward from this? And maybe these two, they are a little bit blurred in this case, because I think they're both speaking to something that's a little hard to distinguish. But it's clearly this notion that Jesus represents this figure who has a very kind of unique connection to God, as being identified as the Son, and in whom God is well pleased, and that this shining radiant light of this figure tells us something about the power and the brilliance and the goodness and the purity of Jesus. And I think, again, related to this as well, is that he's flanked by Elijah and Moses, figures very important in the Jewish tradition. And so there is some situating of Jesus in a Jewish context there that presents continuity, but also a kind of update to that story, in the sense of, in the Jewish context, there is no sense that God has a son and that, he comes to earth and all this stuff. So there's a kind of continuity, discontinuity thing going on. But I would say the parable is, the power and the significance of Jesus as a conduit and a connection to the divine. And I think if you could take that forward, there's the gesture into the archetypal, which is that this is, if you want to say, like, what's your mountaintop moment, you could say, right, for a person having their own experiences, right? Have you ever felt a sense of that transfiguration where you felt, illuminated and enlightened in some sense, and that you were just sort of maximally connected to your centers of energy and power and to the divine? And so the transfiguration at the parable level in its kind of extreme form invites us to consider, how is this, applicable to our own lives and our own experiences? And I think that's the best way into the archetypal reading, which is sort of like, here we get, I think, almost better than in any other context in probably the New Testament, arguably, Jesus in his archetypal form. I think you get the transcendent, illuminated, divine incarnated person who is still fully human, but just illuminated with divine power and energy. And you're on a mountaintop. There's all this sense of just invigoration and vitality and an explosion of sort of spiritual energy, I guess you could say, that frames Jesus as being fully empowered with that kind of divine sacred energy. And so if you want to think about Jesus in archetypal terms of, the Pantocrator image, or Jesus in some sense of like the being of, great power, imbued with that kind of sacred power, I think we kind of get a sense of that here. And again, that ties into what I was saying about the parable level, where, like, to the degree that we all, as individual human beings incarnated in our bodies, can also experience sacred empowerment and an infusion of divine energy, then this archetype is one that we can identify with and experience ourselves, again, in these really peak kinds of experiences where we identify with the archetype of sort of the transfigured Christ. So that would be an attempt to frame those things in those terms.
Well, it's compelling in the way you narrate it, because again, as we started with the previous segment, there is power and significance in perceiving the story through these different layers, and there is a meditative unlocking dimension when we begin to think of ourselves and of our own lives at this time through these different lenses. Is there a way in which your individual life, my individual life, anyone watching us now, individual life, is there a way in which we simply are living and operating within a cultural context and that's it? Or are we able to distill a certain parabol nature or even archetypal nature beyond that? And when we are able to see the archetypal dimension of our life, is there a way in which we are able to transform the archetype, to in a sense become our own alchemized version of ourselves? So in the way you narrated the story, there is that invitation. So by way of personal experience first, the first time I traveled to Mount Tabor was maybe when I was 9 or 10. Born and raised in a kibbutz, which is the secular part in Israel. Obviously never been introduced to the New Testament and to the gospel at that stage of my life. And not for many more years until such time as I decided to pick it up and see what resonated there and why. And but at the age of 12, I participated the most important long distance running, like the national championship used to happen every year next to Tabor. It was called the Tabor race, and I already won the other most important race, and so this was a very important day for me, and I came prepared. And there was a part where we were running uphill, and my strategy was I will take such a lead in the first half of the race. It was a 4K race. I will take such a lead that nobody will ever be able to catch up to me, because my finish was not necessarily the best. And we came from the climbing up hill part, and there were spectators all along from the villages nearby, all along the trail of the race and the running trail, and two jumped just in front of me and started to race as though they were there from the beginning. And I knew they would probably disqualify, but I got so angry in myself that they were trying to cheat and participate in the race. And I experienced one of the first times a kind of a strange out-of-body experience, because I was already exhausted. I was full of lactic acid in my muscles. I was out of oxygen and out of breath. But it's as though I felt I was coming out of my body. And I opened my stride and I bypassed both of them. It was downhill. I was running very fast, and it's tricky and dangerous to run very fast downhill because you can easily fall. It wasn't a paved road. It was a trail. And I reached the line first and fainted for a few seconds, and I had to be picked up. So I had no idea about the transfiguration in any way or sense at that point in time. But in a strange way, I had a transfigurational moment and a kind of an out-of-body experience where a part of you leaves your body, or at least you are not in the limitation of the painful experience, and you're able to do more than what you would be able to do at any other time. So this was one of the early peak experiences in my upbringing, in my youth, and more followed later of different kinds. But in some way, it shaped a little bit my perspective of life. So I bring that into the esoteric inquiry. And the way I would begin the esoteric is I'd often frame an inquiry. So in this case, I would ask the following question. What was the esoteric promise and significance of the axial transition that Jesus Christ fulfilled and actualized? So we did in our part one a trace through the evolution of religion, the evolution of God and religion. And we kind of seeded some things there. But I wanted to get grounded now in this mystical inquiry. So that's the very inquiry is framing something that, again, you can come through the mesoteric and say, well, what do you mean promise and significance of axial transition? And my invitation and my request for anybody watching us, relax for a little bit, just for a few minutes, the scholarly discipline. Just come along for this mystical journey, mystical inquiry, esoteric inquiry with me, because it's a bit like I'm asking you to do aerobatics with me, and I did aerobatics, so I know the experience. When you do the loop in the aerobatics, there is a point where you are halfway through the loop and you see the world upside down. That's why I keep talking about there is a reversal that occurs when you transition to the esoteric. So here are some seeding words to lead us into the esoteric contemplation. The first consideration is that a prophecy, and for that matter any learning, is actualized not when it occurs, but when its occurrence has been witnessed and validated. A simple way to instantiate it. The first time you've been riding the bike, you have not been riding the bike just when you were able to ride the bike. You've been riding the bike when you rushed to your dad or your mom and you said, did you see it was by myself, you didn't hold me now, because the first time now of course they teach, you have all the different sizes, so you get initiated into riding a bike safely with sophisticated biking technology. But in my case, somebody held the bike for me behind my back and ran with me for the first few minutes. And then I remember asking, are you still holding? And he said, no, you're riding by yourself. So you ride by yourself, not when you were able to take the act, but when you have been witnessed and validated. And there is a certain prophecy and a certain vision that is articulated and is infused in all the axial religions in one way or another, which I'm proposing needed to have a moment of validation. So I'm leading in a way to say that the moment of transfiguration is a moment of validation. And there is a need in the unfolding story of Jesus to have a moment of validation. And even when he is telling those three disciples, don't tell anybody, right, but it has been codified and encoded in human consciousness, what they have seen. So that's an important point. So what is it that what was the promise? I would lead into it in this way, which is that the transfiguration serves as the witnessing validation of the axial Christ promise. The Christ promise is the promise that I am proposing is present in all the axial religions, both in the East and the West, and obviously in the Jewish tradition as well. And what it carries is a certain is a promise of a catalyzing shift. And I'm articulating the catalyzing shift here in a particular kind of way. I'm describing it as a shift from a geocentric, earth-centered alignment to a heliocentric, sun-centered, Solaris human. Okay, I'm saying a bunch of words there. But the invitation is to recognize, again, in the context of the way you were narrating the history of religion, Brendan, you were describing pagan religions as the time where humans practiced the sacred in the life of the tree and the life of every animal. In a sense, we were very focused as a species in the planetary presence, in the planetary experience, and the elemental forces of the planet that were seen, were experienced, were visualized, perhaps by the people of that time. And the axial transition is, and ultimately the transition to monotheistic religion, which is why it is called axial, is for an engagement with the divinity that's higher than planetary, that's both metaphorically, but not just metaphorically, is contexted and seen to be a sun level divinity. Now, if you take it as a parable or as an archetypal, you describe that as a metaphoric or a poetic sense. If you truly make an esoteric leap, and here is where I recognize that I'm taking you perhaps out of the comfort zone, but I will narrate it for the sake of those people who want to explore the lens, the esoteric lens. So the esoteric lens will say that there is a way in which we viewed planetary evolution and the evolution of humanity through successive epochs. And that we have to view the permission of conscious life, which is represented in the arising of humanity, as something, the blueprint for which, and the vision of which, is latent in the field of potential in the universe, even before this carnal form of human actually ascend to that level. And then, of course, it needs to go through all the earlier iterations of life, from mineral life to plant life to the animal kingdom, for there to be a journey of complexification in the way that the biological evolution occurs, and that at the same time, that is a journey that describes an esoteric, evolutionary journey where the planet Earth is not just a physical celestial body that's floating in space, but it is in fact a spiritual dimension, spiritual space that is serving as an initiatory crucible for humanity, for the sapiens human to arise, in which the axial transition represents an important and distinct epochal transition, where there is a reason for that developmental evolutionary story to transcend the planetary focus and the finding the sacred in the concrete experience of all living beings around us, where we experience at the time the plurality of angelic presences and such as it is celebrated by pagan practices. And that what the axial prophecy and the axial promise represents, seated with the Jewish faith and in the East with a Buddhist tradition and faith, in the way they condition the mind, is to prepare the human to a point in time where a solar or a sun level, sun natured divinity will actually enter the bloodstream and the stream of consciousness of human life, and will catapult and catalyze humanity to a whole new evolution. And that in that sense, the axial religion all prepared the ground for this shift from an earthbound human, which I am, to make it a little more poetic, I'm describing here as Homo earthus or Homo planetus, in the sense of a species or a human form that's focused on the planetary, to a solaris human, which is in the theological sense centering on one God figure. In the Christian sense, we understand that the one become a Trinitarian. We talked about that on another occasion, that in any esoteric tradition, any one is a Trinitarian. and that the shift was spiritually activated. So the true, deeper esoteric appreciation is that it is activated and consummated by the Christ presence. That the Christ represent a sun quality divinity. And so when I say Solaris, when I say sun level, the esoteric, spiritual, mystical point of view sees these to be not just celestial bodies in the physical sense of these are bodies floating in space, but they each represent an interpenetrating celestial dimension that is dedicated to the evolution of the universe and is each serving in a certain capacity and is giving rise to that crucible of possibility of development that takes hundreds and many, many thousands and even longer years, where the universe does have the propulsion to give rise to conscious life that is ultimately later will become conscious of itself and then conscious of the nature of consciousness, thereby, if you like, giving the universe as a being the feedback loop of a testimony of its own evolution, and that in that sense, the activation of the solar divinity is about birthing a potential in the human that very importantly leads to the individuation process, and that it becomes important to recognize that this birthing divinity is recapitulated in the way it then inspires the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and that in actuality what we are seeing through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment is a recapitulation at the evolution of the individual and the individuated capacity, and that so much of what has occurred from that point onward is essentially arising initially and is encoded in this heliocentric, sun-centered paradigm that appears in one way spiritually in the axial transition and is then admitted and recognized through the scientific method and what it proliferates and liberates in humanity, and that ultimately we are now entering the phase that we are entering a transition to the next phase. That's why this story becomes so important. So I made here dozen esoteric leaps because I wanted to convey it in a story form rather than in a logical claim, where the invitation was, well, what does it feel like when you take these lands, rather than immediately naming all the dozen things that need to be proven first in a logical sense to actually be prepared to enter this space. That is the significance of the transfiguration and in this esoteric lens. And the last thing I'll say, so the suggestion I made in I think in segment 2, I proposed that when you sit down and you write the next book that you're now working on, and you're essentially grappling with, well, how can I reason all the scientific discovery that is so important for us because it enables so many things that we appreciate and love, and also because it disabused us of something that were practically, in some cases, dangerous or were not productive for the progression of the species. But you also want to integrate the line of value. You also want to integrate the line of meaning. You also want to address and heal and remedy all the pathologies, not just of the ancient world and the way sacred was practiced in the ancient world, but also to address the problems born through postmodernity and cynicism and nihilism and the meaning crisis and all that. And you're seeking to make some integration, and you're writing and you're grappling with these ideas. And there are moments where you feel that you are able to combine and crystallize a new perspective, a new something, a new formulation. That in those moments, or for somebody else, it's through their music, or for a third person, it's through their art. The moment we experience inspiration and the thrill of intuitive breakthrough in artistic or conceptual or any other space, really, even in relational and leadership capacity, I would say that there is a fractal, there is a spark of what I'm describing in the esoteric dimension here that we begin to breathe into and experience, in that the potential of that is latent. And I'll say more about that if we do get to do the resurrection today or another segment. But let me pause here, give you a chance to respond to all that.
Well, yeah, so I guess this is a hurdle I have to sometimes navigate when I'm asked to respond in ways that, because you've asked to not explicitly engage with like the critical lens, to leave that to a side and just focus on how this makes me feel or something. And
at least as a first initial
yeah. And so this is always something difficult to navigate for me, because for me, the feeling mode is these are profoundly integrated for me. So, right, if we're feeling, like, for me, cognitive dissonance is a feeling. For me, if something does land or it doesn't, because I'm integrating it into my whole kind of collective holistic view of understanding reality, then that feels good, and I can't divorce that from my, it's all kind of connected for me. So in terms of, I'll start with sort of, I guess, like I think the answer that is probably wanted, which is something like, this makes me feel an openness to story and to a sense of a big meaning to everything, which feels good. And this and it feels like there are points of resonance, and there's a lot of, I don't know, that would be how I'd begin that. And then I feel like there needs to be some ideational content that can come in at some point, right? Which might land, and it's not even critical, but it engages thought structures. And so so if I can be permitted to,
please.
So for me, it's like a lot of things come up about this, and it's on the positive side, right? I can see that this is a way of moving into a level of abstraction that I get, that sort of is able to see, to situate, you could say, the archetype of Christ within a broader network of other archetypes and ideas, that this actually starts to take on not just a kind of singular archetypal sense, but a whole story, right, of that's being communicated here, of this kind of cosmic evolutionary process that's being moved in the direction of this Homo Solaris, and that there's a kind of plan or design to it.
These are difficult words, so these are some of the words we'll have to grapple with.
Sure. And so at least at the level of, does this move up a layer, right, or down a layer, whatever we're gonna frame as our kind of whatever metaphor there. I could see how this could be beyond the archetypal, because it's sort of trying to encapsulate the archetypal and move beyond it. So there's that. So there's that idea, and then there's this other idea, which is, and this is kind of the most fruitful thing for me. It gets me the most excited, but it might be also itself kind of challenging, which is that When I see this, yeah, I'm very like the vibe lands very familiar. There's a narrative here that I'm familiar with from sort of kind of more postmodern new age spiritual contexts in which, there's a sense of, everything ranging from indigo children to aliens to there's some, Earth is part of this sort of broad project that's being orchestrated in some way by higher dimensional entities or energies, and that we're sort of being moved up there. And you get into the realm of the occult and all this stuff, and and so I'm familiar with it in that sense. But then what's interesting to me about it is that I'm wondering if my hangup is not so much that I disagree with it, but just that I'd want to nuance and refine it, which is a promising venture for me, right? Because I don't look at this and I say, oh, well, that's not right. I say, oh, this is a mythologized form of something I do kind of assent to, right? As people know, I view this cosmic complexification process leading to development and the deepening of the soul and the, the person on earth and all this stuff. And so if this were that story in mythic terms, I would say, yeah, that sounds about right. But there's always that recognition for me that there's a value in the demythologizing process, right? So that when we move from the mythic literal story of Jesus to then being able to understand the archetypal Jesus, that itself is a sort of demythologizing move because it moves into the realm of, symbol and image and metaphor and all that. And so similarly, I want to make that move with this. I want to say, yes, I can affirm this if we can also say that this is metaphorical. And in a sense, then what I'm trying to do, you could almost say cynically, what I'm trying to do is invert the esoteric and the archetypal. I want to give an archetypal version of this esoteric story, right? Which is saying something like, okay, if we understand all this in more abstract terms, we could appreciate that. And then we could tell this whole story, much like the story that you're telling, but maybe in slightly different, more science-friendly languaging of it. And so that to me feels like a positive move, but it might land as anything from misguided to condescending, from kind of an esoteric perspective. Last thing I want to say real brief on this point, because I actually think it's really interesting, is that I think one of the hangups for me also around this is just that it reintroduces a historical element that needs to be probed, right? So as we were moving into the abstract before and going into the archetypal and all that, we were moving out of history and we were getting into this space of image and symbol and metaphor. I feel like framing this way returns history in a way that then has to be reckoned with, which means to say, like, well, who, what is this Homo Solaris, and like who are these extra dimensional beings that are navigating or orchestrating this, right? Then we have to grapple with some historical like facts, right? We're back at facts, and then it's sort of like if we're back at facts, then we have to do the whole fact thing again, and we can go there, but it does add another layer. So anyway, I'm sorry. Yeah, that was kind of the best I could. But I also don't want that to sound just critical. Like I think that I don't know. So that's kind of where I'm at. Help me out here.
No,
I appreciate you embarking on the experiment for a start, and some of what begins to surface, and I don't know that I kind of have permission to even go there.
You can go wherever you want, my friend, by all means.
Well, and I also recognize we're going to need to land this, and we'll keep the resurrection story for another occasion. But
I will just say, as a programming note, I have a little more time than I thought. So if you want to go a little bit longer, we can. Yeah, I thought I had to go soon.
I think we would need to separate the resurrection to another conversation. Sure. But you see, some of what you offer there, we would need to enter truly difficult to do on just a YouTube podcast, but because what it invites is also a developmental introspection. What is the psychological dimension that I bring into whatever it is I'm grappling with, and I know it from my own experience, because so part of, and I don't mean this to trigger any allergic reaction in you, because I got that you did get that sometime and I don't know if what I'm going to say is what you've received, but part of what I witnessed on YouTube, not by yourself, but people who often in beginning or the middle of the conversation will time and again assert that they are only based in scientific paradigm and will prove time and again that they are empirical in their approach. And then 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour later in the conversation, they will say something. And then they will say self-deprecatingly, well, of course, I was just running here through a thought experiment. I don't believe this. I can't believe this. It's as though they're saying, to believe this, I would have to, it's almost as though I'm renouncing everything I just declared on the front end. So I find time and again this cognitive dissonance with that is one side of, again, not with you, but I've seen it with others, that they need to do a lot of reputational management to never be seen to be skating outside of a recognized paradigm, because if they did this, if they said yes to that, they will be laughed outside of the scientific conversation room. Now, but let me just, the other side is more personal. That's what I meant by developmental. How much do I assert my argumentation and the way I reason through, the way I map my ideas to maintain a sense of control, or to maintain a sense of I can explain this away to myself such that I'm in the known space. Again, I'm not projecting, I'm not saying that's where you come from, but sometime I will be running into, well, but I can't say yes to that, because if I'd say yes to that, or even to entertaining this idea, I'd have to say yes to those 7 other problems or perspectives, and I'm not prepared to do that, because if I'll do that, I'll be losing control of who I am, what I'm about, and what is the project of my life. So there is always that resistance in the picture as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, a couple of things. One is, so I have some questions for you that I want to pose, and I feel like that'll be helpful and generative. So I'm going to come to that in a second. But just to that last point that you raised, I will say, yeah, I totally get that. I mean, I know that we construct worldviews, and believe me, like my whole work focuses on meaning and how people construct meaning and what it feels like to lose meaning and all that, and how desperately people hold on to meaning. And so that's a process I'm aware of. And it's also one I don't necessarily situate myself outside of, like we're all meaning constructing beings. And so we have to be vigilant about what sort of closedness are we presenting so that we can, as like defense mechanisms. I totally hear all that. Personally, though, I will also say, well, on the one hand, well, I guess I'll put it this way. So like, I'm not closed to believing some out there things. It does come down to what sort of the line of argumentation it is, right? So like, for example, DMT elves, could there be some parallel dimension or infinite numbers of dimensions in which higher dimensional beings we can experience by ingesting some pharmaceutical chemical that will transport our consciousness transducing mind into another sphere that interacts with intelligent beings that are some strange, jangly machine elves, and like this is a real aspect of reality? Like that's a very viable possibility.
I'm not suggesting that, and I'm not suggesting injecting any.
Oh, no. I'm just using an example of saying that that's a claim that's made by folks who explore the DMT space that I find very credible, because and then it's like, why, right? It's like, well, because there's experience, there's continuity and coherence of experience, and then there's like a whole kind of sense of logical argumentation that could be made. Now, in the grand scheme of things, is that where I'm going to hang my hat? Well, I'd need to see more evidence. I need to make more sense of that. But my point is just that it's not beyond me to affirm things that are outside of mainstream notions of worldview or whatever, like as a rule. It's just that it then gets into a matter of what are the grounds for thinking this? And that for me, it needs to be about having really solid grounds for thinking something. So that leads me to my questions for you, which is, what are your grounds for seeing this as the esoteric reading? Like what you've given a sort of reading, an esoteric contemplation. Bring in some more of like why, like what this is based on, so to speak? Is there personal experience? Is you've read a lot of books and you found other people are saying this as well? It resonates with you on an intuitive level. Like there's some, I don't know, empirical evidence, you know, any number of bases for why one might ground a claim. Bring some of that in so that we can do some of that justification or, you know, dancing here.
Well, the short answer to all that you offer there is yes and yes and yes, yes to all of the above. And in some way, there is an invitation there to a much more of a detailed a trace than we have time for. But so, as I offered in my 20s, I was introduced to this idea of look at the world through three lenses. This threefold lens, the exoteric, the mesoteric, and the esoteric. So I have spent the last more than 4 decades of my life traveling these spaces. And for me, that was not something that was separated from a developmental inquiry and the inquiry of practical inquiries of raising a family and supporting my family and all those things. So reading esoteric literature can be a dimension of that, and practicing a contemplative life with certain inquiries for many, many years, holding certain inquiries in mind, sometimes for decades, as one way of investigating the truth about something, has been another dimension to it. And one perhaps a ground that I will for now, in a very short response to this, lend this is a very deep sense, a very deep sense of experience that has become, as I said in the beginning, embodied and souled, and therefore is part of how I navigate life in the world, is the sense that we're not flying here on our own. That the invitation is not, and this is something I would be covering when we talk about the resurrection, not that a fallback to the two-world theology of one world here and another world out there, but that in actuality, the day-to-day evidence of from so many angles, okay, not just near-death experiences and not just experiences of telepathy and clairvoyance and all that. These are more the garden variety, fantastical, sometime for some people the exhilarating spaces to go to, but in a much more day-to-day concrete sense that we are not actually flying here on our own. This is not just a biological experience, that we are in fact not human beings seeking a spiritual experience. We are in fact spirit beings coming into the human experience to gain development and maturation such that we become vessels for continual evolution to occur through us as we are co-participants and co-creators of this evolution, which again is what I felt is compelling in your work, because I feel that there is the convergent zone. So for me, we have now entered, so I will again travel a little beyond the comfort zone. For me, we have entered a unique time where the species is reaching for something beyond Homo solaris, which is why I'm calling the project of that the Universalis project, which is where we are again to embrace plurality. There was an important individuating phase where Solaris was important, but we are now to embrace, even beyond that, a Universalis project, a Universalis paradigm. And so without going more into that, where I would ground the response to your question is the deep sense that we are part of an evolutionary experience. That when I looked at my my parents' generation, and what they've done, and what was because for about a dozen years, I in my youth, I grappled with deep sense of crisis, because the generation of my parents, they escaped the Holocaust and built Israel, and in America was the generation that the great generation, or the greatest generation that built America after the war, and the same in Europe and so on. So they accomplished something so substantial. And for many years, I grappled with what was it that my generation was going to be involved in. And I felt that people that showed up for life in the second half of the 20th century, really following the footsteps of great teachers and developmental teachers. And so the whole esoteric tradition that goes to Rudolf Steiner in one line, and Gurdjieff in another line, and other esoteric teachers in the late 1900s and the early 20th century, and put next to them the developmental teachers, and put next to them the arising of the modern discipline of psychology with Freud and Jung. This entire, you can line those different tracks, those different lanes, and what those different lanes represented was that humanity was now entering a new developmental, new evolutionary phase. And I think that is mapped very well by the Integral project, and that what I felt my life was calling me into is integrate that other dimension into it, which is why wittingly I proposed to laymen last year that we do a conversation that we titled in the quest of the fifth quadrant, which is essentially what we are exploring here, integrating the esoteric dimension into, and I think where you and I are searching and negotiating, which is how do you tell an emergentist story co-arising in the four quadrants, and then find a way to logically and rationally integrate something else. And I don't claim to have found the perfect way of doing that. And I find it insufficient to abdicate the conversation and to say, well, these people are just locked in a scientific paradigm. I will bypass that conversation and relax into esoterica without needing to negotiate. I don't think that's where I'm settled. I want to find a way to integrate your perspective and for you to challenge it and for you to say, well, but here are the 1, 2, 3, 4 claims you're making that I need some more grounding with. Are you talking about what? Are you talking about elves? No, I'm not. But are you talking about invisible beings? Are you talking about energetic beings? Are you talking about luminescent forms of life that are beyond the physical form, that have not yet had scientific tools to validate? Well, perhaps yes. So that's where we're grappling with the limitation of the verification paradigm that we have, and I think that's where we are in this exploration.
Yeah, well, which is great, because I think that these are the kinds of conversations we need to have. And I'm not looking to prove anything, and I appreciate your openness likewise. We're looking to compare and integrate each other's lenses on this in a way that I think can, improve everything. So I welcome that, and I think it's really valuable. And so a couple things come to mind. One is, let's see, where do I start? Well, the first thing I wanted to say is that, I guess the first thing I want to say is that, again, like, there's so much convergence between what you're saying in its broad arc and its broad strokes and what I'm also saying. So I think obviously there's some, now we are, as we've talked about, using different methodologies, and some, I'm like in my work really leaning very heavily as heavily as possible on the scientific literature to try to make certain claims and bring in, the developmental science and the complexity science and all that. That's one approach. to talking about this arc of universal evolution, towards higher states of consciousness. And then there are other modes and other lenses into that, the phenomenological, the contemplative, the esoteric, right? Okay. So then we want to see if we can bring these together in some meaningful way. And that's kind of what we're working on here. And I will just say, so then on all that front, like there are ways I think in which these projects can complement each other. Because if there is a project like the one that you're talking about underway in the universe, then some aspects of that should be amenable to scientific study. And I would argue that we're probably seeing that in developmental sciences, right? When we see the deepening of, emotion and sort of interior states and reflection and all of that, and the widening sense of perspective taking, all that would be empirical data supporting a broad kind of mythos that you're describing. So like that all checks out. And then there are these other elements that you're describing that have yet to be encountered in the scientific domain, right? Are there luminescent beings? I'm not close to there being luminescent beings. I hope there are, in fact, right? And this is, I guess, the point I want to kind of drill in on, because I think it's really important, because I don't think necessarily, like, I'm trying to look for levels of deep convergence here, because I do see them. And I think some of this is just a matter of semantics. Some of it is genuine difference, and some of it is some wiggly space where it could go either way. Where we might be using different methodologies or whatever. But like on the level of semantics, we'll start there. Everything you're saying on this slide, I feel like could be expressed in language more amenable to your kind of run-of-the-mill naturalist, right? Right. So rather than saying the transfiguration serves as the witnessing validation of the axial Christ promise, catalyzing the shift from a geocentric alignment to a heliocentric one, you could say the story of the transfiguration serves as a key emblem or moment of storytelling important to the broader narrative that we see unfolding in human cultural evolution towards a shift in higher consciousness emerging on the planet, and that kind of basic movement that we see in nascent form in the Gospels grows in early modernity and winds up being key to the transition of cultural epochs that we would call modernity and beyond, right? And then I can be like, yeah, that I would totally agree with that. So there seems to be some importance to phrasing what we're talking about in certain terms. And I would just suggest that this is a more mythically flavored presentation of some deep constructs that we probably could have deeper agreement with. Like, do we have to call it Homo solaris, or could we call it something different? So there's a semantic element there. Again, I guess I would also I would say that there are different levels at which we are willing to maybe assent to, this is the next thing I wanted to point out. It's just that, again, there is experience and evidence that we bring to the sense making that we do. And if you are drawing on experiences that you've had and things that you've read that validate and justify this overall gestalt, then that makes total sense. I lack those experiences, right? I haven't necessarily had ethereal, out-of-body astral projection experiences. I haven't been contacted by luminescent beings, etc. So when I go to look for the grounds upon which to base my worldview, those aren't available to me. Now, could that mean I am a lesser being in this cosmic hierarchy? Could be. There could be any number of reasons for this. Maybe it's yet to come. I don't know. But I'm just saying that, like, we are still in the realm of reason giving, justification, evidence, and all that. You just are working with a different set of evidentiary, things to work with there. And then there's just the last thing around sort of methodologies here, and like the points at which something seems like a credible thing to assert or affirm, or where one should remain hesitant and not necessarily assent or confirm. Because, like, for me, I'm open to the existence of luminescent beings. I was talking earlier, there could be a whole other realm of machine elves and other kind of entities out there, like, I'm open to that. I'm also open to, there could be indeed something to the very archetypal notion of an angel that exists in factual space, right? There could be other planets in which the evolutionary process got going billions of years earlier, and so this process has unfolded earlier, and those beings, through their own evolutionary process, wound up developing capacities that now aids them in the ability to traverse the universe and help with the process in other spheres of reality. totally possible, totally open to that. Then it does just become a matter of like, okay, well, if that's happening, we are all operating in the same space, broadly conceived, because there's not this two worlds thing. So there's some way in which these beings can interact with us. And so there's some way in which we can at least make that question amenable to empirical analysis. And I think that we should do that. It doesn't mean that we say if we can't find it, then we reject it. We just mean that seems worth pursuing. Like if this big story is unfolding and there's any way to get any kind of like more solid evidence for this to be able to interact with, more material things, and then we can kind of share that and work from that, I would say all the better. Those were just the main points I wanted to get across. It's just like the esoteric, some things are kind of coming clear to me, are like, or I want to propose these as options, is that like there's a languaging aspect to this. We might want to see what benefits we get from languaging it one way versus another. There's a question of, is there inherently a sort of mythos to the esoteric that needs to be engaged as such? And then the question might be like, why? And then there's also just this question around like, can the esoteric also still be engaged as a naturalistic mode, right? Like, can we accept that all that could be the case, and there might hypothetically be ways in which, if we had the right instrument, we could detect a luminescent being, beside me right now, right? Like maybe there are new instruments and tools and technologies that might be able to extend our understanding of this esoteric sphere. We don't yet have them. But if we can make those sorts of moves, and I think we start to integrate the esoteric with the scientific in the way that it sounds like you're really keen to be able to explore, and me too, right? And where we land on these things ultimately might be just the difference between experiences and what we ultimately, determine as being most credible based on our set of experiential data that we're able to draw from. And maybe I lack the certain kinds of things that put me over that threshold. And that could be part of the developmental process. It could be, again, any number of reasons there. So what do you make of all that?
I make of all that, probably need another 3 hours to to cover that. Here is what I feel called to offer, and I know I probably will trigger more for you, but I do feel we need to land. One of the problems that occurred with the journey we've been on over the last 4 or 5 centuries with the scientific method and with the individuation project that enabled so much, but that we privileged and we privileged the exterior over the interior, and part of what started to occur in the mid-20th century and through the 20th century is actually the counter response to that, beginning to reintegrate the interior just in a whole other way than it was engaged in the ancient world. So we've also exteriorized our focus in terms of tools. We've given credence to the microscope and to the telescope, and we've disenfranchised the interior scope and the inner sense organs. And some sense organs became atrophied and became paralyzed, and some have yet to be awakened. And for me, this inquiry is inseparable from the phenomenology of that transition. I am describing these realms. So yes, I can easily travel with you to stay with languaging and more of a poetic or mythic framing. But the esoteric purist has a point of view exactly, if you like, countering the scientific purist that will say, well, no. In one way, sure, that way of seeing the world can be seen, but there are invisible dimensions in life. And I mean, even when you look at your body, you don't see your interior body. So there are invisible. When you look at a tree, you don't see the roots of the tree because they're so we already are accepting so much that's invisible, even in the physical and the biological. But then there are other realms. We don't see the fluids traveling up and down the trunk of the tree that keep the trunk the tree standing erect and alive. And so the invitation there is that, yes, there are realms that we don't yet have the scientific machinery to evaluate, and perhaps there will be tomorrow or in the future at some point scientific machinery that will give us that kind of an exterior verification. But there is also, Brendan, the suggestion that could it be that there are realms that you couldn't actually verify and are not meant to be verified by exterior scientific measure? I'm not saying that for a fact. I'm saying, are we prepared to entertain that is a possibility, that there are interior dimensions where we're actually not meant? It's like we can't go in, we can use ultrasound, but we can't actually take the embryo or the fetus out of the evolutionary developmental process still in the womb. Now we actually need to wait for the fruition, for the completion of that process to celebrate the emergence of that life. So there is a way in which this is inviting. Could we be prepared to accommodate and integrate that there are dimensions of life that we may not be able to get through to, at least not fully, through the mental portal? That the mental logic rational portal will bring us to the door and will get us situated next to the door, will even help us put their hand on the handle to open the door. But actually walking through the door in some cases will require that we are prepared to put down that set of tools, as I said earlier, and turn around and walk backward into that realm. Again, I'm not saying that must be the case. I'm saying, could it be that is the case?
Yeah, certainly. And there's many things, right? Like my own internal phenomenological experience right now is something you can never have access to. And same with every other person I meet. There are things that are closed to me through scientific analysis. So that's not for me the be all end all, right? There is a sense though in which, again, that broader claim around how we make sense of things in general does still remain. But no, I'm very, I mean, it opens up every answer opens up new questions, right? Like there are realms that we're not supposed to be able. It's like, well, it says who, right? And how do we know? And how can we? And so I think that these continuing to dance around this set of things might be infuriating for some to watch and listen to, because they're like, oh, they're just talking past each other. But I don't think so. I think if we really circumambulate this set of questions, I think we will deepen into something here. Because I think that there's a set of presuppositions that we're both working with that probably we can help each other illuminate. I would hope for each other, right, in some way. I mean, and there's an interesting tension there that I'm also picking up on, which is in one sense you're like, you're interested to integrate the scientific into your perspective, but on the other hand, you're like saying there is this purist esoteric lens that essentially says, no, it's the opposite of that, and you can't let the scientists in here. It doesn't work.
No, not you can't let the scientists. You can bring in a scientific discipline, but of a different kind. You can't let the rational logic that you committed to in the verification process that science is committed to in the first place be the way you enter through the door. There has to be something. Yeah. There has to be a bit more of a courting approach into that realm.
Yeah. Well, I guess just the last thing I'll say on that front is that, like, again, like for me, then barring, a road to Damascus moment or a visitation from beings or whatever, my way into this needs to be through a justification process that makes this seem, more and more plausible, something that I can, whatever, right? Like that's part of the process. And so, that I think is the thing that we're engaged here, is trying to talk about. I mean, in some senses, this is kind of the classic spiritual hang-up, right? It's sort of like the Tao that can be named, or the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, and to whatever degree we're using language and ideas to talk about these ultimate things, maybe they're not accessible. I mean, it seems like we're not necessarily getting at non-dual mysticism here. We're talking about the realms of esoteric and the occult, which is slightly kind of different, but still. So yeah, I mean, I remain open and I remain curious and fascinated, and but as we framed the initial thing coming into this, right? Like, I can get the archetypal, and then into that next phase is where clearly something else has to happen. But then at a certain point, I'm not necessarily sure what the point is of talking anymore, right? Because if it's like, if this is something that just one has to experience and feel and can't really be communicated then into rational terms in the same classic way as we're used to through dialogue, then maybe this isn't something that is to be talked about. Maybe it's just like, and I guess actually this is really the last thing, which is that, again, for me, this is not just like a hang up around, I need to have everything explained completely in the form of an axiom, and then I can, or, an equation or something, and it all has to check out. It's very much about, for me, spirituality is about flourishing. It's about, vitality. It's about richness, and it's about the full realization of potential, however you want to language that, right? And that's wisdom, and that's sinking into the world and being in right relationship to the world, to other, in such a way that is kind of maximally enhancing for self and other and world. And so I see aspects that show up in spiritual discourse that can actually have the exact opposite effect of that, right? And so what unfortunately though happens is that if we are not if the spiritual discourse is not amenable to the same kinds of justification dynamics that, say, science does, or other kinds of discourses, then it remains insulated from critique. And then at a certain point, things just break down into, well, you either experienced it or you didn't, or you are either saved or you're not, or you're either, right, some metaphysical presupposition that is sort of proposed as sort of a take it or leave it sort of way. And if one leaves it, then one's, lesser. But there it all is. And this, of course, creates a lot of dynamics that have been really destructive, just across the board. And so I feel like if I have a project here, right, it's that I'm interested in courting as deep as one can go into the spiritual and the esoteric domains. But I'm kind of like, who is it? In the story of the labyrinth, Perseus, whoever, he goes in, he's got Ariadne's string, right? I don't want to get lost in the labyrinth. People get lost in the labyrinth when they give up on the string of rationality, right? And I think if we're actually not just trying to be in the labyrinth, but in some senses, maybe we're trying to map the labyrinth, then we really need that string. I think that whatever the mystery of existence is not going to be threatened by us posing questions to it. And I'm not at all suggesting that you're saying that, but I also think that the kinds of mysteries that we can experience can be amenable to these multiple different lenses. And one of them can be critical scrutiny. And so I'm looking for that balance too, of trying to bring questioning, evidence, all these kinds of argumentation dynamics that can be able to make a robust movement into the esoteric. And that doesn't have to be a scientific thing, but it does need to fulfill those certain criteria around reasons and evidence and experience and coherence and those sorts of things. And there also does need to be a moral component as well. And a kind of like, oh, well, this person's doing the esoteric thing, and look, they're radiant light, and this person's doing it, and they're radiant light. I want that radiant light, So there's that aspect of it. But that's part of our experience and our evidence that we're basing things on too. So that's just a potpourri of responses there. And just to kind of give you, a kind of summation of still where I'm coming at. I'm open. I'm interested. I'm not in any way trying to certainly not be disrespectful or closed. I really am as open as I can be. I feel like my role here, to the degree that I have one in this sort of space as a metamodern space, is to try to like keep putting these tensions out there into the space of critical scrutiny around these most important issues. So anyway, that's all.
And I appreciate it, and I admire your tenacity and rigor in that. Yeah, and the passion that you bring, and the unique the unique biographical experience that fashioned in you a certain set of experiences that produced in you a certain alertness, and you're serving from that place, and you want to see these addressed. So I admire that, and I appreciate that very much. And I for one enjoyed very much these now almost 3.5 hours run, the two segments, breaking the world record here. Thank you very much, Brendan.
Thank you. Look forward to future conversations with you. Much appreciated.
Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.